The gospel of Jesus Christ is not the message of accusation or condemnation and guilt that destroys your life. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not about how much you must serve God or what you must do for God. No. The gospel of Jesus is the message of how He serves us with His love, and how He loves us unto freedom where we can dwell in freedom. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the message of God's eternal acceptance of His people, wherein creation waits for people to know that they are not nothing but loved and embraced by Jesus Christ. The gospel is the gospel of His grace, and that is why we are living by grace.
Greetings everybody. Today we are continuing our series wherein I am going verse by verse through most of 1 Corinthians 15, and we're going to talk about what the gospel of Paul was, what he actually believed. Now, in last week's message, I've spoken on 1 Corinthians 15 verse 1, and we saw that the gospel was basically, and this is what I emphasized from Thyron and also Strong's, that the gospel is the good news of the kingdom. And what Paul is referring to here when he talks about the gospel is something that he has in mind, which is not just good news, but it's good news of the rulership of God through Christ in the earth. The word gospel, according to Paul, was not the message of how you can go to heaven. But the gospel that Paul talked about was the good news that death and whatever effect death would have in the earth, it has been conquered by God in the man, Jesus Christ, and that this Jesus has now been given dominion and rule, and that everything should be put under His feet. What that means is that the rulership that He has and what He has attained in His resurrection and what God has attained through raising Jesus from the dead, that the effect of that would flood the earth. That is the gospel that Paul had in mind, the good news that even bodily death is conquered. In other words, sin and death is conquered, and that we are now under a new man, the resurrected Christ, and not the dying man which was introduced in Adam, but that we are under the new man, the immortal man, Jesus, and that He's got His effect on our lives. Now, I would advise you to go and listen to last week's message again. Just go there to 1 Corinthians 15 part 1. This is now part 2, and we're going to have many parts explaining what Paul said here. Now, Paul connected the gospel with the gospel of this kingdom with the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Now, today we're going to talk about how important it is to believe this truth. And we're going to touch on a very complex matter, and that is the matter of salvation. How does salvation work? Basically, who is saved? Can you lose your salvation? And so forth. And I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 15 verse 1 and 2, and we're going to especially look at verse 2. It says, "Moreover, brethren," this is now verse 1, "I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also you have received, and wherein you stand, by which you are saved, if you keep in memory, which I preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain." Now, last week we have seen that the word receive means to basically take unto yourself, or to have yourself associated with a certain truth. That is how you receive something. It basically means to make it personal. So when Jesus died, when you can say, that death is also my death, the resurrection is also my resurrection. So we see here clearly that Paul says you have received the gospel, you are standing in the gospel, I have preached it to you, you have believed upon it. And then in verse 2 he comes and he says something that is shocking to many of us and that brings a lot of fear to us. And he basically says here that we are saved by this gospel if we keep in memory what I preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain. Now, the first point we're going to look at there is the part where it says, by which we are saved. We are saved, and you can follow in your notes. Just want to make this announcement. I forgot to say this before the service. If you want the notes for the service, before the service, please write to us to info@dynamicministries.com and just request it, and we will send it to you every Thursday, and then you can follow in the notes. It says, and I wrote here, by which we are saved through faith. We are saved by the gospel, the resurrection of Jesus, as we have trust in it. By grace are we saved through faith, and we see that in Ephesians 2 verse 8. As many as believe shall be saved. John 3:16, the very words of Jesus recorded by John, that those who believe shall not perish but have everlasting life. So we see that belief is a very important aspect of salvation. We're not saved by our faith. We are saved, let me put it this way, we're not saved by our persuasion. Our persuasion is not our Savior, or the power to be persuaded, or the human ability to be persuaded of something. That is not what saves us. The gospel is what saves us. And what Paul is talking about is the resurrection of Jesus, the fact that Jesus is the Lord and that He has the rule over sin and death. That is what saves us. But what it also says here is this works and manifests in those that believe upon this truth. And that brings a thing in our lives where we so many times live with fear. Do I have enough faith? Do I believe strong enough? Is there enough faith in my heart? Now, the moment you ask those questions, you are already thinking that amount of persuasion, or how strongly you persuade of something, that salvation is in that, on how deeply you're persuaded. No. Salvation is not in how deeply you persuaded about something, but actually in what you are persuaded of. So salvation is by the gospel. This is what Paul is saying here. And I'm going to explain to you what is, because there's a deeper thing in this passage. He says, by which we are saved. We are saved by the gospel. We're not saved by our works. We are saved by the announcement, or by the truth which we can announce, which is that Jesus is raised from the dead bodily, and that we can now also be saved from sin and death. Now, when we look at the word saved there, I didn't put that in the notes. I'm just going to quickly mention it here. When we look at the word saved, the word saved means to be kept safe, or also to deliver. So what it's saying is that God can save you, or we are saved by the gospel. We are kept safe from something else. So there's something that wants to kill man. There's something that wants to destroy your life. And we are kept safe from destruction or death by God as we are believing on Jesus Christ. Now that might bring the question, why does God only protect the believer? What is it with God? Why, if He has the ability to protect all people, why doesn't He just protect all people? Why just the believer? Why is He only having His protection over the believer and not over all people? And that's a big question that a lot of atheists have, a lot of people that turn away from Jesus Christ. And the answer to that is what I'm going to focus on today. we're going to talk about how faith basically works. But as a foundation, I want you to know that to the Apostle Paul, believing this truth is crucial. And he's coming in and he's pointing out, and he says here, "My brethren, I declared unto you the gospel which I preached unto you." I have not changed the message. You've already received this. You've already associated with this. You've already seen yourself as part of this. You are already standing in this. Now, what he's actually trying to say to them is, there is no need to change what you believe. And the context is, Paul preached to them, other believers or other preachers, Greek influence, the Sadducees and all those people came and they would preach a message, and then the believers would start to be deceived and believe something else. And what Paul is actually saying is, if you start to believe all these other things, it's going to ruin your life. He's actually going so far as to say that you could have believed in vain, meaning that the first time you believed, that will have no more effect on you, that Christ would have an effect on you, but that as you've changed your belief, you would now find that Christ has no more effect on you and that your life can be destroyed. That it would basically be as good as if you've never believed in Jesus. That is what Paul is saying here. And I think you will also understand now why I am so focused on the message of the resurrection, that we believe it and that we continue to believe it. Many of us, when we first believed in Jesus, we believed that He died and that He rose again, and we call upon Him for salvation. And that's where we started. And we experienced great power from that, although we did not understand the depths of it and exactly what it means. But as we have believed upon that and got involved in reading the Bible without understanding and in different churches with different doctrines, we found that our belief was changed into a very legalistic, law-based message, which we can testify. Many of us who've been under the law and then got into the grace message, we can testify that under the law, we were depressed. We had lives that was not good. We felt overburdened with all the practicalities of religion, and we actually didn't have a life. In my case, I had it so bad that I basically said that I was happier when I was unsaved or before I believed in the Lord than when I was believing in the Lord, but believing wrong things about God, being under the law. And this is what Paul is talking about. And as an introduction, I want you to look back at your personal experience wherein you received the Lord. After you've received the Lord, and this is the testimony of many people, they became legalistic and they lost their lives. They had a life in the world. Then they believed upon the Lord. They were greatly empowered unto a brand new life as they first believed upon the Lord. But as their belief got into all the different church doctrines and teachings, which is not in line with a simple message of the gospel, the very life you had was lost. The life you had was lost, and there was no experience anymore of the life of God and the peace of God manifesting in your life. You were not kept safe from the very things that were harassing you prior to your salvation. And that's what many churches then call to backslide, or basically to fall back into where you've been. We're going to look at that today from the perspective of God's grace and the goodness of God. So Paul comes and he says, I'm declaring the gospel to you again, and it's not a message that has changed. It's something that you're familiar with. It's something that is that you've already accepted and believed upon, and you've seen the fruit of it. But I want you to continue in that message, and he's now going to preach the gospel to them. Because if you change from that message, your life is going to be destroyed. Now that sounds like, oh, I don't want that. It's all about my power to just believe the right thing and all. This is actually very simple. All you need to believe is that Jesus died and that he rose again, and that what God has promised to bring forth in Jesus, that he will bring forth in your life, and then you rest in that. Don't add teachings of sowing, reaping, tithing, going to church to get a blessing, submitting to the leader to have an anointing, have 20 people lay hands on you to try and get another gift or a this or a that, or have all these different add-ons. Don't have that. And this is what has happened in the people with Corinth. I believe, and this is my opinion, that the message of the Sadducees came in there, which said that there is no resurrection. And these people start to believe in Jesus, but without the promise that there will be a bodily resurrection of themselves. And Paul says that would be falling away from the very gospel, and that would leave you without the life of God. Okay, I want to go and just go to you can go to the notes, Galatians 3 there. We're going to look at Galatians 3 verse 1 to 3, and then also verse 10 to 12. And then we're going to go to Galatians 5, and we will be looking at verse 1 to 6, and then 15 to 25. And this will really help you understand what Paul said. Now, before we get into these passages, I'm going to tell you what they say. This is what Paul tries to say in the following passages. He's trying to say to people that God is not basically deciding who he's going to save, should they believe or not. But that salvation is something that God has given to all, but through faith, we are using what God has given to all. So it's not for God to decide who he will save. It is for man to partake on what God has already decided and given unto all people. Galatians 3 verse 1, he says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth, crucified among you? This only would I learn from you. Received ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, that you are now made perfect by the flesh? Have you suffered so many things in vain, if it yet be in vain? You see, Paul's also talking about this vain thing, you know. He says, I don't want you to believe in vain. 1 Corinthians 15. Here he says, if you begin in the Spirit and you want to end in the law, then you would have believed in vain. He says, if it was only in vain. What he means by that is, if I was only wrong about what I believed, then you could have at least moved on to some truth. But now you are busy with the truth and you've moved away from the truth. And what would that mean? That would mean that you are now under a power that is going to destroy your life. It says here in verse 10, for as many as are of the works of the law, they are under the curse. For it's written, curses every man, or everyone that continues not in all the things which is written in the book of the law to do them. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident. For the just shall have immortality, or live by faith, or the faithfulness of God, and us also being faithful to the fact that God said, I'm going to be faithful to you, you rest now. So we must be faithful to the message of God will be faithful to us, and we don't have to be faithful to him by the works of the law. I hope you hear what Paul is trying to communicate here. He says, and the law is not of faith, but the man that does them shall live by them. So what is he saying basically here? He says, you started by believing in the resurrection, the Spirit that raised Christ from the dead, and by that Spirit, fruit was seen in your life. So why do you now say, I want perfection or immortality by the works of the law? He says, can you not see that should you do that, meaning you start to believe something different now, that you will be under the curse? Now, Jesus did become a curse for us, and He conquered sin and death, and He offers now His rulership to all people, so that people don't have to live by their works anymore, but that they can basically simply just live by reliance upon God. But even if Jesus has died for you and was risen from the dead, if you refuse to believe that or believe something different, even if you have believed the truth, you will find that the life you live is connected to what you believe. And that's why Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, is so adamant on having the people believe the true gospel. Now, next week, we're going to go much more into what this gospel is. This week, I want us to see the importance of believing the right thing. This is what today's message is about. That's verse 2. It's all about the importance of knowing that when you believe the correct thing, your life is shaped by the thing that you believe in. Should you believe in a lie, your life would be shaped by the lie. Should you believe in the truth, your life will be shaped by the truth. Not because God decides to shape your life when you believe, but because of the dynamics of the human heart, which we're going to get into today as well. So we find in Galatians 3, he says to them, you started in the Spirit. Do you now want to be made perfect in the flesh? He says, if you've started in the Spirit and want to be made perfect in the flesh, you were even persecuted for the gospel for no reason, because you are losing the very thing you were standing for. Now, you might differ from me and say, Bertie, I don't agree with you. Do you want to tell me that we can basically lose the salvation that God is giving towards us when we start to believe a lie? Well, you can answer that for yourself experientially. When you believed in Jesus, when you first got saved, were you very happy? You answer. And then, when you started to believe the law, did you lose that joy? Now, you were saved unto the joy of God. You were saved from bitterness and hatred and everything, so many things that you were saved from, and you experienced salvation from it. But when you started to believe in works righteousness and had a wrong belief, what happened to your life? You basically lost your life. Now, there's a passage which I have not in here, but I'm going to read it quickly to you, and this is the experiential knowledge of the Apostle Paul, and we're going to go to Romans 7. Romans 7. It says here, know ye, brethren, I speak to them that know the law, how that the law has dominion over a man as long as what he lives. For the woman which has an husband is bound to the law by her husband so long as what he lives. But if the husband dies, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if the husband dies, and she's free from that law, so that she is no more adulteress, though she be married to another man. Verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. No, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, you shall not lust. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence or lust, for without the law sin was dead. Verse 9. For I was alive without the law once. Paul's talking about himself. He says, I was alive without the law once. What is he talking about? He's talking about what he is warning the people in Galatia against. He says, you started in the Spirit, now you want to be perfected by the works of the law. He says, don't you know that those who are under the law are under the curse? And now you want to go back to legalism and law. What is he saying? You'll go back to the cursed life by not remaining in the grace, which is the message of the resurrection. He says here, when I went back to the law, he says, I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. So what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, I believed the truth. The truth brought life to me. But when I started to believe that I'm justified by my own flesh or by my own works, I found that the life I used to have, which was God's life in me, I parted from that life and I started to die. That's what he's saying. That is Paul's experiential knowledge. I've got that experiential knowledge, and I'm very sure that even if you are not agreeing with what I'm saying today, you have the same experiential knowledge, wherein you believed in the truth, then you believed in the lie, then as you believed in the lie, you found the fruit of the lie in your life. And what Paul is saying is, basically, when you're not believing in the true gospel, you are falling from the very influential power of eternal life on your life. That is what he is saying. And that's why it's important to believe the truth. That's why it's important for preachers, when you read the Bible, to study it and have an open heart from the perspective of God. I want to preach your truth, and I want to radically stay at the truth, which is the simple message of the resurrection and that Jesus is Lord, the gospel of the kingdom, which I spoke about last Sunday and the Sunday before. Let's go to Galatians 5:1. It says, Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again into the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, now you can underline that in the notes there. If you be circumcised, now to who is he talking here? He's talking to the believer. And he says, Christ shall profit you nothing. Can you see it? Let's read verse 2. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, going back to the law, Christ shall profit you nothing.